We'll now take a look at the notion of nested loops. We've mentioned before that we can have if statements inside of if statements. Well, the same thing is true for loops. We can have loops inside of loops, and this is what we call a nested loop. And what's nice about nested loops is it allows us to solve a lot of problems very efficiently. So let's just take a look at an example. So let's say we want to print the pattern something like this. So we have like a bunch of stars that are in a triangular formation. Now, of course, we can easily do this without loops because there were only 5 lines of stars that we need to print, but just for our purposes, we'll use loops anyway. So we'll start with one for loop where we'll say for I is 1 and I is less than or equal to 5, and we'll increment I, where I here is just going to keep track of which line we're printing. And then we can use I as an upper bound for how many stars we're actually going to print on a given line. So for example, when I is 1, that's the first line, we only want to print 1 star. On the second line, we want to print 2 stars. Well, I is 2 at this point. So let's just use I as the upper bound of the number of things we want to print. At iteration 3, we want to print 3 stars. Iteration 4, we want to print 4 stars. And the last iteration, we want to print 5 stars. So since we're incrementing I, let's use it for the condition of our inner for loop. So here's our resulting code. So we have our starting for loop where we check if we have I is 1, we check if it's less than or equal to 5. But look at our second for loop. So first of all, we see that we can put it inside the body of our for loop. But here we're using I as the condition of our second loop. So we have j equals to 1, and we check if j is less than or equal to I, and then we increment j. So when I is 1, when we run this inner for loop, we're going to print 1 star. So we would have something like this. And then when I is 2, we're going to run this for loop 2 times. So we would print 2 stars. And then the next iteration, I is going to be 3. So we're going to print 3 stars. And then when I is 4, we would do 4 stars. Get the fourth one. And then the last iteration where I is equal to 5, we're going to run this for loop 5 times. So we'll do 5 stars. There we go. So this is what our program would output. Let's go ahead and implement our nested loop example from the previous slide. So we need to do a class. We'll call it nested loop. Let's do a main string args. Now we need some loop control variables. So we'll do I and j. We'll do the outer for loop. So I is 1, I less than or equal to 5, I plus plus. And then our inner loop, j equals 1, j less than or equal to I, j plus plus. System.out.print, print our star. And then we need to do a print line to make sure we're printing on the next line. Let's save it. Go ahead and compile it. And let's run it and just see if we got, here we go. So let's pull this up a little bit. So here we go. There's a star on the first line, 2 stars on the next one, 3, 4, and 5. So this does print out what our program said that we were going to do. Now, there's a couple of variations we can do with this. What would happen if we replace the first loop with something like this? Let's change the first loop and see how our output would be changed by just making a couple of little changes here. So let's say instead of I going from 1 to 5, let's say we have I go from 5 to 1. So maybe I equals 5, and then I greater than equal to 1, and then we do I minus minus. So let's change it. So now we start from 5 and go down to 1. So think for a second what would happen if we did that. So I mean, if you need to pause, go ahead and do so. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look and see what would happen. Let's go ahead and save this. We'll recompile it. And let's run it. Let's find out. So now we print 5 stars on the first line, and then 4 on the next, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1. So this is pretty much gives us the exact opposite of what we were printing before. So when we were printing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, now we're printing 5 stars and 4 stars and so forth. So all we do is just change one line of code and our output looks completely different. So I mean, it's a really neat thing we can do here. Let's go ahead and set this back to what we had before. So 1 is there equal to 5. Okay. Now here's another question. So what if we wanted to print n lines? So here we're printing only 5 lines. Well, we can make some changes to do that. So think about it for a second on how we can say maybe like let the user enter some number, and that's how many lines we print. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Hopefully you thought a little bit about it. So what we need to do is we need to give the user the ability to enter in something. So we need to import java.util.star. And we'll do static scanner console equals new scanner. System.in. We'll add an n. And then n equals console.next int. But we do need to make sure we ask the user something, so let's do that. Enter an integer. Okay, so now we've asked the user to enter some integer and we stored that in n. So instead of making this 5 as our upper bound, let's make this n. So we say I goes from 1 up to n, and then we just print that many stars. So let's save that, compile it, and see what we get. So let's say I do something like 10. Let's say I enter 10. So sure enough, I'll move this up here so we can see that we print 10 rows of stars, and each row has an incrementing or increasing number of stars. So 1 star, 2, 3, all the way down to 10 stars. So the point here is that we can make just a couple little changes in our for loops, and we can get some very different results. And this helps us accomplish a lot of things in our programs. Let's take a look at another example where we can use a nested for loop. So let's say we want to print a multiplication table, something like this. Doing this by hand would be really tedious. Trying to write a program to do this could also be tricky, especially how large, if you have a very large multiplication table. So we can use a nested for loop to come up with some very elegant code for printing this. Now with this example, we can use the same outer for loop that we had from before, because we're just printing 5 lines and each line is going to print 10 numbers. So if we want to print a single line, well, we have 10 numbers, so the upper bound of the number of items we're going to print is 10. So what this means is for row I and column j, all we need to do is just print I times j. This means we can use the following inner loop. So we can say for j is equal to I, as long as j is less than or equal to 10, we can do system.out.printf %3d I times j. Now I'm doing the %3d because remember, we want to have a little space in our multiplication table. So this will mean that each number has exactly 3 items. So this allows us to align our numbers correctly. So for example, if I is 1, then we're going to print the numbers 1 through 10. If I is 2, well, we're going to print multiples of 2. We're going to print 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 because we're going to multiply j with 2. And we just keep repeating this until we get all the way to 5. So here's the resulting code, which is pretty much everything we've talked about. And we did include a system.out.println statement at the very end of each iteration of our outer for loop. This is because when we're done with our inner for loop, we're at the end of a line. We want to make sure that the next iteration prints on a new line. So this just lets us print on that next line. So here's my point with this. Take a look here. We have 1, 2, 3, we have 4 lines of code, and this will print an entire multiplication table. It's just fascinating that we can take a few lines of code and produce so much data for our output. Now let's go ahead and implement our multiplication table code from our last slide and see what happens there. So we need to write a program, multiplication, yeah, that's fine. Put it in our main, static void main string, be good if I can type. So let's do our for loop. Well, we need some stuff here. So we need some variables. All right, so now let's do our outer for loop. I is 1, I less than or equal to 5, I plus plus. And then for j equals 1, j less than or equal to 10, j plus plus. And then we'll do system.out.print f %3d. And then we'll do I times j. And then here we'll do system.out.println. So we'll save that as multiplication. Let's compile it. And let's just see what happens. So we run it. And there we go. There's a multiplication table. That's 5 by 10. So we can make a couple of changes here. So I mean, the whole point here is just showing that we can produce so much data with just a few lines of code. It's really neat what we can do. Like for example, let's say I change this 5 to a 10. Now let's recompile it and run it. And there we go. We get a 10 by 10 multiplication table. But we can do even more. Let's do 20 by 20. I mean, I can just do this all day. This is so much fun. No, we don't want that. Make that go away. Okay, compile. Let's run. And here we go. Now the numbers are getting a little too close when you're dealing with triple digits. We can fix that. Let's make this 4. Let's compile. We can run. There we go. That looks a lot better. See, I mean, look at that. We just came up with we just output 100 numbers, just like that. Multiplication table 20 by 20, and we can go even farther. Don't believe me? Let's do. Let's see here. Let's do 50 by 50. I might break this. Let's hope I don't break it. We'll up this to 5 just to be safe. Let's compile this and run it. Okay, that might be a little too much. I didn't break it, but it's still producing a table. It's just exceeding the length of our lines here. We'll just give it a second here. Okay, so this would be a complete line if we shrink this down a little bit, but sure enough, it does work. The whole point is we can just produce so much data just by changing just a couple lines here. I mean, look at this. We only have like 4 lines of code. Well, 5 if you include the declaration statements, but just a handful of lines of code, and it produces all these numbers. So there's just a lot of neat things we can do.